now. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get going here. So if you're just joining us or you didn't hear, we're all in the chat mentioning the coolest bird that we've seen this week. If you are partaking, what are you drinking? And we're going to add a third question here for you guys to keep it lively. Are you wearing any Plover attire? I want to see some Plover Watch t-shirts or anything like that, or earrings, or you name it. Go ahead and put that in the chat there. No shame whatsoever. So I'm going to try to keep this really quick, get going here, but a little bit of housekeeping. Once we get going here, I'm going to mute everybody. While our speakers are speaking, we're going to keep you guys muted just to avoid any weird noise or feedback. And then when we get to the end of the program, after we've asked a few questions of our panel, our moderators asked a few questions of our panelists, we're going to leave it open for you guys to ask questions. So what we're going to ask you guys to do is to put your questions in the chat, and then we will call on you to ask your question in person. You can unmute yourself and ask that question, just because we want to, keep it personal here, see your lovely faces and hear your voices, even if it is just through a computer screen. We all need a little more personal human interaction. So welcome everybody. Thank you. My name is Edward. I am the president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and welcome to Birds and Bytes. This is our third episode doing this. This is a COS program in partnership with Chicago Audubon Society and Peggy Notebart Nature Museum. And obviously today we are talking piping plovers. What's Plover Watch 2020 going to look like? The status of piping plovers in the Great Lakes overall. And we have a really killer panel here today of experts who are going to talk to us all about it and give us all the lowdown on what this year for plovers is going to look like. So big shout out to them. Thank you all so much for being here and spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it. A few other things. We also have a website, obviously, chicagobirder.org, where you can look up our all upcoming events. Obviously, we don't have any hikes coming on right now for the sake of sheltering in place and trying to keep our distance from each other, but we are planning to continue this series every other Thursday at least going into the future. So please feel free to visit our website and our social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, where we will be giving you guys updates on when those events are happening. So I think that's all from me. I'm going to go ahead and bump it over to Chris Mikulik, who has a word about our partner brewery this week.
Hi, everybody. Chris Michalak, board member of Chicago Ornithological Society. This is kind of a riff off of Birds and Beers, but, Birds and Bytes being all virtual and everything. And as part of that spirit, we wanted to make sure that every episode that we do, we feature a local brewery or bar that has been a valuable partner to us or affiliated bird groups in the past, just as a way to give a shout out, give something back. This is a no cost to them, but we wanted to make sure that we highlight a few places. This week, we're going to be talking about the Galway Arms. Not a brewery, but a Irish bar and restaurant that has been very, very generous to COS in the past, particularly hosting our La Ba Woods fundraisers every other year for free. They don't charge us a nickel for it, which is extremely generous. They also have hosted numerous meetings. Of course, we drink a lot, and they like that. So anyway, they are located at 2042 North Clark in Lincoln Park in Chicago. They are open and doing pickup and delivery. So, if you get a chance, you're interested in getting some Irish food, please stop by, grab a bite, tell them that COS sent them or sent you. And with that, I will hand it over.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and just really echoing that, Galway has been really amazing to us in the birding community, so definitely consider supporting them. I'm going to pass it real quick over to Stephanie with our trivia questions for today's program. Go for it, Stephanie.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie and I'm also a board member with COS and I also work with Audubon Great Lakes. And I all questions and give you something to think about during today's program. We're going to be giving the answer at the end. So to get you thinking and about some bird trivia on the theme of plovers and other shorebirds, our first question, and we'll reveal the answer at the end of the program. The first question is, how many pairs of Great Lakes, or how many piping plover pairs did lakes last year? I think Sarah might reveal the answer, but stay tuned and you'll find out. And our second question is, which shorebird has the longest migration that also stops over regularly in the Chicago area? So which of our shorebirds of the variety of plovers or sandpipers have long migration that also Chicago? There are trivia questions, so we'll repeat them at the end and we'll find the answer at the end of the program.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Some stuff to noodle on there. And I'm going to go ahead and stop talking now. I'm going to pass it over to our moderator for the evening, Carl Giametti, COS board member and former president, who will get us started here. Take it away, Carl.
Great, thanks, Edward. So I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today, and I will also stick on afterwards to facilitate some questions with our esteemed panel. Yeah, so I'd like to introduce Sarah Saunders here. Sarah joined the National Audubon Society in 2018, where she's a quantitative ecologist in the science division. She lives in Michigan and works on projects focused in the Great Lakes region, including marsh bird populations and collaborating with the Audubon Great Lakes team in Chicago. Sarah has also conducted analysis of data to determine how climate change is impacting distributions of bluebirds and nuthatches throughout the United States. Her background ranges from modeling monarch butterfly populations while conducting research at Michigan State to studying organisms as diverse as red-sided garter snakes and tigers. However, of greatest interest to the subject of this event, Sarah received her PhD at the University of Minnesota working with Dr. Francie Cuthbert, where she studied environmental and genetic factors influencing survival and reproduction of the Great Lakes piping plovers. So with that background, I am thrilled to introduce Sarah, and we can all give her a virtual round of applause. So take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Carl. Let me get started. Let's see. Hopefully this works. Yes. Well, thanks for that. I'm very excited to be here. This is perfect timing as plovers are returning to the Great Lakes region. And I'm also a Chicago. Oh, yeah,
Stephanie, your notes.
Again?
Yes, I'm sorry.
What's the point of practicing if it messes it up? Okay, better? Cool. Yeah, so I'm also a Chicago native, so I'm really excited to be talking to you guys and about plovers. My PhD studies species, and I'm still pretty heavily involved in a lot of the recovery efforts and banding that goes on each year. So I'm always happy to talk about plovers, and of course, as Carl mentioned, I did a lot of this research and work with Francie Cuthbert at the University of Minnesota, so I want to make sure and acknowledge her. So today I just wanted to give a pretty broad overview of piping plovers, talk about the distribution and population trend in the Great Lakes region, cover the threats and the current recovery efforts that we have going on, as well as focus a little bit on the research that I did as part of my PhD, but specifically how my research really applied to management of this population. And then of course, talking about plovers would not be complete without a few stories from our individual birds. Since we've been banding them so long, we have the life histories of a lot of these individuals. So there are three populations of piping plovers. There's a Great Lakes population that we are all familiar with, and that's about 70 pairs on average, at least in the past couple of years. There's the Atlantic Coast population, that's about 2,000 pairs. And then the Great Plains population is about 2,300 pairs, and they nest on inland lakes and rivers. And so the Great Plains population and the Atlantic Coast population are both listed as threatened, whereas the Great Lakes population is listed as federally endangered. So in total, the global population of piping plovers is about 8,800 individuals. This is just a little bit of a zoom in of some of the frequently used nesting locations in the Great Lakes region. I realize this map is missing Chicago from last year, but these are the most frequently used locations since we've been monitoring them since the mid-1980s. So historically, piping plovers were distributed throughout the entire Great Lakes region. There were probably about 200 to 400 pairs in the beginning of the 1900s, distributed across 60 nesting locations. And this included 8 Great Lakes states as well as Ontario. And like I mentioned, they were across all 5 Great Lakes. But at their lowest point in the late 1980s, before they were listed as endangered, the Great Lakes population was between 12 and 17 pairs. When they were listed in 1986, there was about 17 pairs remaining, but they did end up dipping down to 12 pairs after listing. And they were only located in northern Michigan at about 6 sites, and only on Lakes Michigan and Superior. But then last year in 2019, we reached 71 nesting pairs, which was not our highest. I'll show that on the next slide. And they were distributed across 30 nesting locations in 5 states and Ontario. And then once again, they were nesting on all 5 Great Lakes. And that was in no small part due to all the recovery efforts that I'll talk about. So here's the population trend. Since we've been Great Lakes pipers, again, were listed as endangered in 1986 when there were 17 breeding pairs remaining. Predator exposure began in 1987, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And captive rearing really started in earnest in 1997. And those 2 recovery measures were really instrumental to increasing the population, as you can see. And then last year, again, we reached 71 breeding pairs, but our highest was 76 breeding pairs. You can see that in 2017, 16, and 15, we had about 74 to 75 breeding pairs in that plateau. We dipped a little bit in the last couple of years. So what are the threats that are facing this population? They can be kind of distributed into 2 different categories. One is habitat loss and degradation, and that comes in the form of shoreline development, beach recreational use, and beach grooming. So shoreline development was really a key threat in the beginning when they were first listed as endangered in the late 80s and early 90s. It's kind of leveled off over time, but in response, beach recreational use and beach grooming has really increased in recent years. We still have a lot of issues at some nesting locations throughout the Great Lakes region related to beach grooming, just because people like to have kind of sandy, cobble-free beaches, and plovers need the cobble for nesting. So that becomes a conflict. The other category of threats are human disturbance, and that's really related to dogs off leash, human-related predators that come around like raccoons and domestic cats that are associated with people and their summer houses along the beaches, as well as all-terrain vehicles. We have some issues with people using ATVs, especially at beaches in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And that's not to mention the climate-related threats. Over time, botulism outbreaks seem to be increasing, which is shown to be related to climate change. And that can be really detrimental to fledglings as well as adults. Botulism outbreaks don't tend to happen until later in the summer. And so that's when obviously fledglings are around as well as the adults. And so that can become an issue. If we can't locate those individuals and get them to vets and get antitoxin to them, then they cannot fight botulism. More frequent storms is an issue with climate change. This leads to a lot of nest inundation and flooding if nests are located too close to the shoreline. Reduced ice cover that's happening with climate change doesn't sound like it would be impactful, but if there's reduced ice cover in the winter, then that tends to mean that there's more vegetation that stays on the beaches throughout the winter and doesn't die back. And so more vegetated beaches means narrower shoreline for plovers to nest in the summer. And then similarly, the high water levels that we've been experiencing in the Great Lakes means that our shorelines are getting narrower and plovers are being pushed closer to the tree line, and that's where a lot of their avian predators like merlins reside, and so they're more likely to lose their nests to avian predators if one of the mates goes missing. So all of these sound like a lot of threats that are impacting the plovers throughout the Great Lakes region. So what are we doing about it? Well, one, we have a lot of partners that we are working with. In addition to the University of Minnesota, Francie Cuthbert that runs the banding crew each year. We work with a lot of partners, Wildlife Service, Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as University of Michigan Biological Station, where we house our captive rearing project, as well as the state DNRs and the National Park Service. And we also work with a lot of zookeepers from the Detroit Zoo, as well as throughout the entire country that come and staff the captive rearing center in the summer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the recovery of this population over the past 25, 30 years is definitely not possible without all of these partners and how they've contributed to the various efforts that we've put in place. So recovery for this population is really a 5-pronged approach, and I briefly want to talk about each one of these. You guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with beach closures that you've been seeing, at least last year in Chicago. Public outreach is a key component, as well as nest protection, captive rearing, and annual banding. So for beach closures, we close off 100% of the nests that we find. And this includes exclosures that go directly over the nest. And so these prevent avian predation as well as mammalian predation, but the slats and the fencing are still big enough to allow the adults to go in and out for incubation. And we exclose 100% of the nests that we find. And when we started doing that in 1987, we found that hatching success increased by about 83% in the population. And so it's a really key component to making sure that those eggs hatch and we have wild chicks out there. So we're going to keep doing that. And then in addition to exclosing nests, we also close off part of the beach around the nest with psychological fencing and signage. And that really is just for humans to be aware that plovers are nesting. Sometimes the exclosure, you can see, kind of blends in with the background. And so that really makes it clear that beachgoers should avoid that area, because even if, you know, you're not getting directly up to the nest, the incubating adult will get knocked off the nest if there's a disturbance nearby, and then they won't be incubating. And so that lowers the chance of hatching success, which is why we really try and pair the beach closures with the exclosure as well. So monitoring them daily is really key for protection. It sounds like a huge endeavor, and it really is, but you guys in Chicago are familiar with that. You did a wonderful job last year keeping an eye on Monty and Rose and their chicks. And that's really what we try and do at every nesting location in the Great Lakes region. So it's a huge undertaking. We staff a lot of the nesting locations with college students, or volunteers or employees from different agencies. And their job is really just to monitor the individuals. If there's adults incubating, make sure you're seeing both adults every day. Once they hatch, monitor the chicks and count how many chicks you're seeing every day so you can get a sense of how chick survival is changing over time. And then really to educate beachgoers and serve as an outreach tool and let them know that, hey, there's, you know, nesting endangered birds on this beach and to keep your distance, and really just taking the time to talk to individuals and show them plovers through the scope is really powerful, and it makes people aware of the fact that they're sharing their beach with this important bird. So they do monitor training sessions each season in the beginning of May in 2 different locations in Michigan's Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula, so that the UP monitors and the Lower Peninsula monitors are trained in a standardized way so that they know how to interact with beachgoers and take data and monitor these birds. Of course, public outreach is a key component. I don't really have to tell you guys that because Monty and Rose became celebrities in their own right, but throughout the entire Great Lakes region, we really try and not only have people staffing those beaches, but also do public presentations. We have brochures and videos that are circulated, as well as news releases. Of course, we have social media with this Facebook page, Great Lakes Pike and Plover Recovery Effort, as well as our own website. And all of these have been really instrumental in increasing awareness about piping plovers. It was kind of surprising when I first started my PhD back in 2010 how few people knew what a piping plover was, even though they've grown up in Michigan or in the Great Lakes region and spent their summers going to beaches, and they didn't know about them. So this has really changed the story. One of my favorite parts of our recovery effort is salvage captive rearing. So if one of the mates goes missing on a nest during the breeding season, we take in those eggs just because the remaining mate cannot both incubate the nest and feed themselves during incubation. And so we don't want to lose that nest and the potential productivity. And so we take in those eggs and we rear them until those chicks are fledged, and we release them at the end of the breeding season. And our captive rearing center is based at the University of Michigan Biological Station in Pellston, Michigan. That's at the top of the Lower Peninsula, about 20 minutes from the Mackinac Bridge. And like I said, we have zookeepers that come from across the country, and they staff that captive rearing center all summer long in like 1 or 2 week shifts and raise those chicks. And we have both an outdoor pen that you can see here that's on Douglas Lake, which is part of the biostation, as well as an indoor pen, and we make sure that they're exposed to the elements as they're growing from hatch to about 35 days old is the average age that we release them. So here's a snapshot of releasing some captive reared individuals back to the wild. And we always try and release them at nesting locations where there currently are wild chicks, so that they have fellow friends to migrate with and learn from. And that has been a really good strategy over time. And then of course we have annual banding that I've alluded to. So our goal is to band all chicks and all adults every year in the population, and we have been really successful at that. We have about 98% of the population marked. We have a couple individuals that show up each year that are unbanded, and we think those individuals are either from the other populations, the Atlantic coast or the Great Plains population, that don't do as much banding, or they could be from nesting locations that we missed in the Great Lakes region from the previous couple of years. But it's really only a couple individuals that show up each year that are unbanded. Otherwise, we're catching adults on the nest during incubation. That top left photo you can see is a potter trap that we use to capture the adults. We take out the real eggs and replace them with donated clay eggs during this procedure, and then we trap the adult and band it and then give them their eggs back. And that's a pretty efficient procedure. The chick banding is a little bit more challenging simply because, they're precocial, and so they can get up and run around within hours of hatching. And so that makes it hard for us to catch them because we can't be at every nesting location in the Great Lakes region before they are capable of running around. So a lot of our banding procedure for chicks involves kind of slowly circling around them with these really soft nets that we have and dropping them on top of them. And then we band them all together and release them back to their parents. And that whole procedure, if there's about 4 chicks in the brood, can last about 15 minutes. And then we have those chicks banded. So that banding has been happening since 1993, which means we have a lot of data on these individuals. We know who they are, we know where they nest every year, what offspring they produce, and who they're related to. And all that information has been really helpful in doing research, especially when I was doing my PhD. I used this long-term banding data set for a lot of my chapters. And the goal was really to ask questions that would give us answers that we could apply to management. And I want to just give a quick overview of some of those important research. So first, one of the chapters that I worked on, one of our results was that female site fidelity increases fledgling success. So basically, the longer a female spends at a particular nesting location, the better she is at rearing her offspring to fledging. And that's a really important thing to learn for management, because it shows that protecting established breeding sites is really important versus restoring historic sites. Not to say that restoration is not important, but it really demonstrates that protecting those breeding sites and making sure they stay high quality is going to be important to ensure that those females keep coming back to that location, accruing that location experience, and being more successful in rearing their offspring. And this picture is from North Manitou Island, which is part of Sleeping Bear Dunes. And this is a site that's been consistently used over time. It's really high quality, and it's devoid of people. Only the monitors are allowed there. So that's one of our sites that's really established, and that females can accrue that location experience. Another finding that we have is pre-fledging chick mortality leads to male-biased adult sex ratios in this population. So we tend to have more males showing up in a given year than females. And we found that mortality was really happening for females, was happening at the chick stage, but it wasn't related to hatching date or body condition. So we haven't pinpointed exactly why that's happening. But it tells us that we need to increase monitoring during that critical 10 to 23 day window. When chicks are growing up, before they're fledging at about 23 days old, to understand why chick mortality is occurring and why it's potentially happening to females more than males at this time. And also continuing to sex chicks to determine if there are any trends in that adult sex ratio is important. And so obviously you can't sex chicks by looking at them. You can't tell the difference between males and females at that young of an age. But we were pulling feathers when we were banding chicks, and that allowed us to sex individuals. So continuing to do that is going to be really important to see if we have any changes over time in the sex ratio. We found that early hatching chicks are more likely to survive their first year. So that really points to the importance of finding and protecting those early season nests. So sometimes when we have monitors that are college age students, they can't start until mid or late May, but this is really showing that chicks that are hatching earlier in the season are surviving better. And so we need to find those early nests, make sure we exclose them, and put the signage around them so they're protected and that they hatch and that those individuals survive. We found that body condition prior to fledging influences first year survival. So that really shows that limiting the recreational use of feeding areas is important in addition to nesting areas. So typically we just think about the exposure and the signage around that nesting area, but like I said, chicks can get up and walk around within hours of hatching. So really trying to understand what areas they're using during that pre-fledging period is going to be important. We found adult survival is negatively influenced by Merlin abundance. Like I said, they're one of their main predators. And we have kind of an ad hoc approach to Merlin control and predator control. And so really trying to understand what are some methods that we can do to reduce Merlin-induced mortality of adults is critical going forward. I should have mentioned that we're at about 75 breeding pairs, but the federal recovery goal for the population is 150 pairs. So we're only about halfway to that goal. Banding has told us a lot of stuff over time. In addition to what I just talked about, the banding data has showed us a separation of the 3 different populations. We have very little crossover between the Atlantic, Great Plains, and Great Lakes population. It's revealed longevity and mate and site fidelity, as well as genetic diversity. And then also wintering locations and migration routes. So this is an interesting story of one of our females, OFGGXY is her band combination. And because we have such heavy monitoring that is going on in the breeding grounds as well as the wintering grounds, you can almost get real-time observations of these individuals. And so here's a photo of her at Sleeping Bear Dunes at 10:15 on July 22nd, which is right around when females start migrating back south in mid-July. And then this is a picture of her at Crandon Beach State Park near Miami at 6:45 in the morning on July 24th. And so that means, assuming that she did not stop, that she traveled that distance in 44.5 hours, which is a little over 1,300 miles, and so she must have been moving at an average of 31 miles per hour. So that's pretty interesting to be able to say that just from banding data, just from photographers going out there and getting pictures of this individual. So in that spirit, I just wanted to close with a few plover stories from some of our favorite Great Lakes birds that we've had over the years. First is Box G, or Old Man Plover, as he is lovingly known. He lived to be 16 years old, which is the tied for the oldest age plover we've had so far. He produced 37 fledglings in his lifetime. In his last summer, which was the summer of 2017, he disappeared midway through his incubation period. And because he disappeared, we had to pull the eggs just because his mate could no longer incubate the eggs and then feed herself. So we brought his eggs to captive rearing. One of his eggs was fertile and it hatched, and so that was his 37th offspring that was raised and released. We named him Junior, and there he is on the bottom right when we released him at Sleeping Bear Dunes. So that was his last chick, Junior. And OBXB, or Rocky, is another interesting story. So in his first year, when he was nesting, he decided that he would like to incubate rocks instead of his own eggs during his first breeding attempt. This was before my time, but the story is that the bander showed up at the location to band him, and he went and he set the trap, replaced the real eggs with the fake eggs and set the trap, and then went to hide out and wait for Rocky to go into the trap. And he was watching from his scope, and Rocky came back and he sat down right next to the trap on a scrape that had rocks in it instead of the one with eggs in it. And so the bander couldn't trap him because he wouldn't go in the trap. So instead he put the trap on the rocks, and then Rocky went into the trap to incubate his rocks. And so that's how he got banded. But the next year, he was found incubating 3 eggs plus a rock. And then his mate added another egg because they lay 4 eggs. And so she added the 4th egg and he added a rock. And so that far right picture is the 4 eggs plus a rock. And he just continued to incubate the 4 eggs and the rock that year. But then once his chicks hatched that year, he never incubated rocks again. So I'm not really sure what his deal was with the rocks, but maybe it was kind of his security blanket until he knew how to become a father to his chicks. And then another father story is Packer Boy. He was hatched in 2006 on North Manitou Island, part of Sleeping Bear, but he's actually been a consistent nester at Fifth Avenue Beach in Manistee, Michigan. And he's been a really successful father. In all but 2 of his years he's been breeding, he's fledged 3 or 4 chicks, which is quite an admirable task, especially at Fifth Avenue Beach in Manistee, which is a really popular beach for people as well as dogs off leash. But he's been really successful, and we're hoping he returns this year, and he would be 14 years old. So he's definitely getting up there in age. And then obviously he's named Packer Boy because of his band combination of green and yellow. But he's been also a very good plover dad. What are some stories? Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. If you're seeing a breeding plover in your walks outside, please make sure to email this Gmail address. If you're going to locations, especially that we may be unaware of. If you want to learn more and hear more plover stories, please check out greatlakespipingplover.org. I know we're going to probably talk about monitoring this year, but we're definitely getting started with monitoring. We have a lot of people in place. Stephanie Schubel is the head of our banding crew, and she's getting ready to go out monitoring, as well as get the banding crew ready to make sure we're getting all those adults and chicks this year. So we're maintaining our really high detectability of individuals with all of our banding. So thank you for listening about plovers, and I'm excited to answer questions.
Okay, Edward, if please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel, and then I'll kind of guide us through a few questions that I've prepared here, and then we'll be able to take some questions from the audience. Is that correct? I think that's how we're...
Yeah, that's right. So go for it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to introduce the four panelists that we have here, and Sarah will join our panel as well, so all five will be available for questions here. So we have Luis Clemency, Bob Dolgan, Tamima Itani, and Brad Semmel. So I just have a short bio for each person here, just so you can kind of, for those who don't know some of these folks, kind of get a little introduction. So Luis here at the top of my page here, so I'll start with you. Luis Clemency is a field supervisor for the Chicago Field Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Highlights of her 20-plus years with the agency include co-chairing the Whooping Crane Eastern Partnership, negotiating sturgeon passage around hydropower dams in Wisconsin, working on endangered species policy in Washington, D.C., and conserving piping plovers on New York State beaches, and now in Chicago. The Chicago Field Office team is currently focused on conserving a variety of species around the Chicago area, including dragonflies, rattlesnakes, orchids, the rusty patch bumblebee, and of course, the piping plover. So Bob Dolgan is the creator of the film Monty and Rose about Chicago's endangered piping plovers. Bob started the project as a volunteer for the 2019 Plover Watch effort at Montrose. Bob's a lifelong birder and the founder of a marketing communications firm, Turnstone Strategies, that is currently managing the Nature Loves Chicago campaign. Bob is also a board member of the Chicago Ornithological Society. Tamima Itani is vice president and treasurer of the Illinois Ornithological Society. And in 2019, she co-led efforts to monitor the Monty and Rose nesting attempts and chicks at Montrose Beach. She admits to a piping plover addiction and has no interest in treatment. Finally, Brad Semmel has been natural heritage biologist for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources in Northeastern Illinois since 1994. Brad's primary responsibilities are to provide management oversight for state parks and dedicated natural areas throughout the region. He is responsible for restoration, habitat enhancement, controlled burns, and other land management activities, as well as monitoring endangered and threatened species and working to protect sensitive resources of statewide significance. In 2019, he took on additional responsibilities as a state endangered species recovery specialist. Thank you all for joining us and agreeing to let us pepper you with questions. I think the first question I'm going to kind of ask here to Brad, and certainly any other panelists are welcome to chime in, but I think the question that is on everyone's mind here, given the sheltering in place and the lakefront closure, is how might beach closures affect the breeding of the plovers?
Well, I think that the plovers returning now, and I think there are at least 4, if not 5 individual plovers along between Montrose and Waukegan beaches right now. They're going to find beaches very different than when they typically have had to deal with joggers and walkers and dogs and other things on the beach. And so I think these birds these initial birds seem to be ones that have nested over on the Michigan side, so they're going up on the wrong side of the lake right now. But I think they're going to find a lot more opportunity to be foraging, which would be a real positive in terms of being able to put on some body fat and reserves before they start to nest, because they won't be disturbed quite as much. Because if you watch, every time the plovers are feeding along the beach, they'll be feeding for a few minutes and somebody will come by and they'll have to fly by or fly around or walk around them or fly around the individual walking down the beach. So I think it has a real positive potential for increasing some reproduction this year because of increased body fat and reserves before the nesting season starts.
Great. Yeah, I guess, it's kind of, I suppose, a silver lining in typical birders and people not having access to the lakefront, is that it may end up being a good thing for the plovers. Kind of the flip side of that is a lot of the information that was fed to government agencies came from visitors to Montrose and the beaches, and I think there's a lot of concern is, and Luis, I'd like to direct this question to you, is how will we be able to monitor when the plovers arrive? I mean, certainly there's Montrose where we know they nested last year. Waukegan Beach is still open, but there's also possibilities for like Rainbow Beach on the south side. what efforts are being taken by Fish and Wildlife or other government agencies to monitor plover arrival?
Yeah. So outside the city of Chicago, we've had the birders out, like you said, at Waukegan doing some great keeping eyes out. And we might know more, I think, about plovers at Waukegan this year than we've ever known before. In Chicago, the Chicago Park District staff have really stepped up to keep an eye out, and they've sent us some reports and good pictures. And there's a couple, Brad's also been out, and Fish and Wildlife can go out, and we have USDA biologists who've also been out and given us some reports. So between us, the different levels of government, we're keeping an eye on the beach. And we're primarily keeping an eye out to really know. So Fish and Wildlife Service, we're really trying to respect the governor's orders and only do essential activities. And so we're giving up on a lot of the information, the wonderful information that we had last year. Like, when does Monty first show up at the beach? We might miss knowing that this year because we're limiting our activities to what's just really crucial for nest protection. So keeping an eye out as it gets closer to, if we see Monty and Rose back at the beach, for example, at Montrose, and we see nesting protection, then we'll be out more so that we can establish the cages over the nests, like Sarah talked about, because that's of critical importance. But a lot of the other just monitoring data and timing data that we get, usually we're sacrificing this year for the public health.
But Louise, if I may, Chicago Park District is there though, right? So we'll get some information from them.
Oh, definitely. So we've already got, for example, a lot of you might have heard that we haven't seen Monty yet at Montrose Beach, but we've had another Michigan plover show up at Montrose Beach. And we know about that because the Park District staff have been keeping an eye out, making an extra effort to scan for Monty and Rose. And so they took some really good photos, and we were able to send it to Stephanie at the Great Lakes Piping Plover Recovery Effort, and she could tell us the whole history of the bird. And so we really appreciate the Park District and their contractors take, extra stepping up this year to look out for the plovers, along with the rest of the team.
So I'll take this opportunity here in my position as moderator to put a shameless plug. If you need a private citizen to have special permission to go to Montrose, I fully volunteer for that job. But so we're talking about the official monitoring capacity, but certainly a huge story of Monty and Rose's success was the volunteer effort that took place. And I know the three main organizations that collaborated to ensure Monty and Rose's success, COS, IOS, and the Chicago Audubon Society, have been meeting to kind of strategize, anticipating that the beaches could be open sometime in the future. Tamima, would you be able to touch on how some of the volunteer monitoring efforts are shaping up this year, given the uncertainty? What is being planned for the hopeful eventual opening of the beaches?
We had been meeting regularly to plan for the volunteer effort, and we're going to have to kind of see how if the lakefront and the beaches reopen and how they reopen, so to what extent people are allowed back. One of the things we had planned that would have been very different from last year was, we were planning on separating the monitoring of the birds and the nest from the public outreach effort. We wanted to have people focused on the birds and the nest, and then people who were able to focus on people and educating them, being able to show them the birds, with their binoculars and with their scope. I think, with the virus situation, one thing we're going to have to change is, our ability to allow people to look in a scope and allow people to look in binoculars. So I think that's something that's probably going to have to be sacrificed this year. We're going to have to evolve that. I think right now we just don't know when the beaches will reopen and what the boundaries will be. So I think we'll just have to adapt fast when that happens. But that was one of the main changes we were planning on doing, is the separation of roles between education and actual monitoring of the birds and nests.
And I think that makes a lot of sense too, because one of the remarkable things to me, just kind of observing and being a small part of this, was the incredible personal connection that people had with the plovers. Luckily, Monty and Rose were fearless, and so even without a scope, people were able to observe these birds up closely and really develop an intimate connection with these birds. And clearly, one person who formed an incredibly intimate connection with these birds was Bob Dolgan. So much so that he decided to make a movie about this, and I've now seen it at least a half a dozen times. And and it gets me excited and emotional all at the same time every time I watch it. Bob, can you talk a little bit about how the reception of your movie and how people who have had those kind of experiences, whether it be volunteering or simply just stopping by to see the birds, how has the movie been received? How many showings have you had? How many people have you seen it? And I know you have some news also to share about the movie with us.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is, like, the beach closers have made it really inconvenient for those of us who are looking to make a sequel to this film, because I was going to be like out there with our camera person when Monty and Rose returned, and we can't do that now. So we're starting to get really creative with how we will kind of tell the next chapter in the story. But no, I mean, we had 17 showings of the film before the shutdown happened, and we had unfortunately to cancel a lot. And I mean, I think it was on Piping Plover Day, which was November 18th of last year, as declared by Governor Pritzker. We had a happy hour, and I kind of blurted out, like, this was like a life-changing moment for a lot of us, and an incredible experience that we'll never forget. And I think, like, that's, at least for me, I felt like that was true, and that it just was this kind of serendipitous moment that a lot of people came together to experience, and you couldn't have sort of like predicted it, and just the outpouring of support, the passersby that were coming to the site every day, people who didn't know much about birds at all, learning a little bit about birds, was just such a huge win. And then, for it to end up on the front page of the Tribune was just, again, something you just couldn't imagine when the summer started. So I think, there was there's been a great response to it. We, as late as February, we had 120 people at a showing in LaGrange, which I was way beyond what I could have imagined. So I mean, it really took on a life of its own. But I think it speaks to the potential we have to tell great stories of many species. And we have migrants arriving right now through our neighborhoods. You could center in on many of these species and likely tell an interesting story about them. So, but the outpouring of volunteer support was incredible, and I think, I know Matt Agleski, I think, might be on the call. Carl, Tamima, you guys were getting so many emails. It was just hard to believe at a certain point. Yeah, I think so. Some news that WTTW Channel 11 will be airing Monty and Rose on Saturday, May 2nd at 5:30. So we now have got it onto broadcast, which again, didn't think that was going to be possible. But if you get a chance, mark the calendar, and I'm sure we'll have something going on before or after that to commemorate that, and maybe have another Q&A or something like that. So yeah, so really exciting that it's getting that kind of notice here now, almost a full year ago since this whole story started. So yeah, I mean, I'm seeing so many names and faces on the call. I mean, thanks to everybody here who either contributed footage Aaron Tedesco contributed the music. I mean, you know, and contributed photographs and came to a showing. It was truly a community event. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, move over Avengers Endgame. Here comes Monty and Rose. But well, you know, so we had a wonderful celebration event after, you know, a couple months after Monty and Rose continued on their migration and the chicks fledged, where Dr. Cuthbert shared some surprising news that Rose had made it down to the Florida Keys on her wintering grounds and was spotted by a photographer down there. So Sarah, you know I asked you this if you had a surprise for us 2 days ago when we did our little practice call. 2 days have passed. Any good news for us? Come on, got a little surprise.
No news on Monty and Rose, but everyone's showing up. So we have 5 pairs at Sleeping Bear that are, you know, making scrapes, and no nests yet, but they're coming. We haven't checked the southern sites like Silver Lake and Muskegon and stuff yet, and that's the goal this weekend.
So can you refresh, you know, our memory, you know, for those of us who last summer was just a blur, and, you know, remembering when everything happened is kind of difficult. You know, where are we in plover migration? I mean, you know, what you know, obviously we know plovers are starting to show up. Is this, you know, the cusp of when they're starting to show up? What is kind of the window we're looking at for plover migration?
Yeah, this is the beginning of the window, and males show up first to secure territories. And so we're not seeing very many females yet, obviously. So males are showing up like the 10th, I think, was our first sighting, or the 11th, and through the end of April. And then females tend to show up in the beginning of May. And usually our first nest that we find is mid-May, mid to late May, like in the 20s. So we're not going to see any nests yet, but probably in about 3 weeks, especially if we have an early spring and the temperatures get warm enough, then that kind of triggers them to nest a little bit earlier. So it's still very early, so don't lose hope yet. They're on their way. Give them some time.
So kind of in. Oh no, go ahead.
I might just.
But the fact that, oh, sorry, Brad, go ahead.
Okay, I just might interject there that most of the birds that have nested in Illinois before, usually we end up having a much later season than those birds that are nesting further north. And we think those birds might be going up north and are finding filled territories, or something happens to them up north and then they start back south. So in the 2009, 2015, and 2016, they were very late nests as well. And so we thought that those are birds that had gone up north and then returned after finding something unsuitable, or maybe competition with others up north. So our birds for some reason, seem to nest later than those further north. And Sarah probably knows the data better than I, but she might comment on that.
And I was just going to say that because they have high fidelity, that once they're successful at a location, they don't do as much prospecting. So they tend to come back directly to that location and start and defend territories and wait for their mate to come. And so the fact that they were successful last year might mean that they're back and getting ready earlier than in the past.
And Monty and Rose last year, their first scrape was June 3rd. So, you know, I mean.
So we got some time.
We got some time. One thing that I'm kind of wondering about, Sarah, is, you know, is Montrose big enough from your experience to potentially have 2 nests?
Well, now that's getting greedy, isn't it, to me?
Of course. Of course.
I think so. I mean, honestly, it's been a few years since I've been to Montrose, since I'm in Michigan now, but the picture that I showed of North Manitou Island with the Dimmock's Point, it's not a very big point, and we've had like 15 pairs nesting on that point before. So they won't, I mean, they're not colonial nesters by any stretch of the imagination, but they will nest pretty close to each other. And that definitely makes for quite the challenge when it comes to chick banding and trying to separate out the broods and give them different combinations in there. But yeah, I think, you know, there's good potential if it's good habitat, and the shoreline remains fairly wide, then you could have more than one pair for sure.
So I just have a couple of questions, and I think, Edward, we can go ahead and turn it over to kind of the audience and for some other questions there. But, I guess this is kind of an open question for Brad or Luis or Sarah as well. Where is the best place for people to go for information? Obviously we're all waiting on bated breath for Monty and eventually Rose to show up. How can people stay informed?
Well, I mean, yeah, Brad's the local person to stay informed with, but if you're, watching virtually or remotely, then the Facebook group is probably the most up-to-date information, the Great Lakes Pipe and Plover Recovery Effort. And Stephanie is posting on there, and she posts every time she hears about new individuals and a lot of photos and stuff. So
and what Facebook
updated.
group is that?
The Great Lakes Piping Plover Recovery Effort.
Okay, so if you're looking for up-to-date information, go check out that Facebook group. And Brad, it looks like you were about to say something as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like the information that we had the birds on Montrose, we made sure that we're getting this back through Stephanie and Sarah and others, so that they can put that post it so people can follow it through any of those different means. And of course, eBird for any of the birds that are at Waukegan or any of the open beaches. But just we're very cognizant about trying to get anything we see on these closed beaches out to the public, so that there's not this, things are going on without people knowing. We're trying to get this through these very well-known websites and sharing that as best we can.
And then, pairing along with that, Tamima, let's say the beaches are opened up. Where should people go to stay abreast of volunteer opportunities, to either be kind of an outreach monitor or a plover monitor, kind of the two roles you had talked about? Where's the best place to go to stay informed about that?
So the Chicago Audubon, actually, so we were actually in the process of sorting that out when this happened, and frankly we didn't go any further with that. We were actually going to create a dedicated website that wasn't specific to any of the societies, where people could go and find the information. So unlike last year where we actually were emailing back and forth for volunteers to sign up and all of that, this year our plan is to have a calendar where people could actually find what open spots were available for volunteering, and on a website they could sign up for volunteering. So our plan was to have a dedicated website and have people sign up and find information. So we would be reducing the traffic of email significantly this year.
Right. Yeah, I know. Everything was kind of done on the fly last year, so it's great to hear that iOS, CAS, and COS are all kind of ganging together on that.
Yeah.
Edward, do you have something to say there?
I was just gonna say that, and I mean, this is a testament to the partnership last year, which will obviously continue into this year. All of the organizations involved have very active social media presences, from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram. And when it's time to get the word out and rally the troops, that all of us will be putting that call out on our social media platforms, and that's probably one of the best ways to stay involved. Chicago Ornithological, Chicago Audubon, Illinois Ornithological, definitely follow along.
So I guess before we start taking questions from the audience here, I warned Brad that this question will be coming, but undoubtedly one of my favorite moments from last summer was the chasing away of predators with a remote-controlled car on the beach. That's just I guess sometimes conservation biology just comes with whatever tools are at your disposal. Any new surprises for predator deterrence here? Drones or some other remote-controlled apparatus?
I guess the biggest problem with any of that is, of course, you don't want to disturb the plovers themselves. So last year, working with the USDA, they actually have laser pointer that seems to be working very well against gulls. It's a certain color and a frequency that I don't think is readily available on the market. So that seems to be what we're working with right now with the USDA staff and some of their efforts, because they do a lot of work on the lake shore with the gulls. And so they have a lot of experience. And so again, it's really remarkable how all these different groups, both the general public through the COS and CRS and all those groups came together with Chicago Park District and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA, and everybody just seemed to flow together quite seamlessly and work just remarkably. So I think this year, no matter what, there's certainly going to be some very unique situations, but I think reaching out will find a certain niche for everyone to play a role no matter what happens. And I don't know, everybody who I was trying to scroll back and forth, but since we might not be able to get to Chicago Beach and Montrose, I want to put a shout out that the Save Our Shores up in Waukegan has done just a phenomenal job with outreach and some of their things. So if there's somebody here, please speak up. That if somebody wants to get involved in piping plovers, there seem to be a lot up there, and it would be great to know who's there. So if there's any more monitoring that could go on up there and help the Save Our Shores people up there in Waukegan, please announce yourself and let them know how you can best get in touch with you.
We have anyone from that effort that'd like to just chime in here real quick? Edward, maybe someone who's raising their hand.
Sure. Kathy Garnis, and I'm one of Emma England's volunteers. She brought me on board to develop an educational resource for the Sharing Our Shores volunteers that turned into a 15-page Dunesland Habitat Guide. So that's available to, it's on the Field Museum website under the field guides, and that's available to anybody that's interested in learning about the flora and fauna of the lakefront. And it was specifically designed to help raise awareness about the piping plovers and their habitats. And
Thanks.
It's still a thing. So they're still planning to monitor, as far as I know.
Great, and certainly, I think we've had talks about this before. iOS, CAS, and COS. Don't think I'm going out on a limb here that Monty and Rose decide to head up to Waukegan and leave our fair shores here. Organizations will certainly help out our Lake County brethren in any way possible.
Thank you.
So that said, Edward, I don't know have you been collecting some audience questions here for our panel?
So one of the first ones we got was from Janet Pellegrini. She had a couple, one about telemetry and one about just nesting locations in general. Janet, are you comfortable with unmuting and asking that question yourself?
Yeah, sorry, it took me a minute. Yeah, so I'd rather start with the last question first, because I think more of the people that did the plover monitoring be interested in. I'm curious, because of the deserted situation of the beach at the beginning of the spring, what if the plovers select a site that's in the middle of a normal trafficked area? Will the Fish and Wildlife try to encourage movement to a more advantageous site?
Like, God help us if they choose North Avenue Beach for a nesting site or something like that.
Yeah, or next to the boardwalk in Montrose. I mean, obviously all the activity had them move over towards where the swallows were, but now without that activity, they might select something that wouldn't be very secure.
The good news is that nesting plovers, especially when they've been successful, and with 2 chicks, Monty and Rose were quite successful. They beat the average last season, so we definitely could consider them successful. They're likely to return really close to where they nested before. So we've got our fingers crossed for that now that they know the beach and they've had success there, that they'll go back, and the park district has kind of prepped the swallow nest area the same way that they did last year. And so it's definitely a concern, Janet. And I know, we were on a call with our Michigan folks too, and there are beaches where there are plover nests, and an off-road, vehicle, ATV kind of use. And so they're really nervous about the plovers picking a place that will suddenly turn out not to be safe. But my fingers are crossed for, and I don't know this for sure, but really hoping that they'll return to the spot that worked for them last year.
And if they don't?
Well, then we'll have to protect a spot that's not as convenient to protect. So we'll just have to roll with what they deal us.
And I don't know how far back you're familiar with the nest, but the first nest site was about, I think it was 11 feet off the main sidewalk that went along the beach. So they didn't pick the best nesting site. And so we were actually quite fortunate that that first one flooded out. I think that they were able to go into a site that we were able to protect it much more efficiently than that first nesting site. So hopefully
and then Rose had something to do with that second selection as well, from what I remember.
Yeah, I think we may have to get Mayor Lightfoot's help. Right?
So, and then Janet, you had another question about radio telemetry and if any plovers have been affixed with, like I know blackpoll warblers and some other shorebirds have had that. Has there been any consideration, maybe Sarah, this is a question for you, for affixing GPS units to piping plovers?
Yeah, they've started doing that in the Atlantic coast, and it's definitely something that we're talking about in the Great Lakes.
And there were actually plans for that to happen this year, but because of the social distancing and people staying home, I've heard the tags are in the refrigerator at the Fish and Wildlife Service office in Michigan to stay tuned for another year. So they'll try next year.
Okay, next question, Edward.
So it looks like we've got Kathy Garnis. She just posted a question. Kathy, you want to ask that question?
Are we concerned that Monty hasn't been seen? I think you brought that up, Edward, that Monty's been sort of off the radar. And if so, would Rose be able to find a new mate? Do they mate for life? I don't really know much about their habits.
If their mate returns to the same location, like if the male shows up first and then they wait a period of time for that mate to return, and if the mate doesn't, then they'll find a new mate. But so she could easily find a new one, and especially because we tend to have an abundance of adult males, that's definitely a possibility. But it's also not that concerning that Monty hasn't been seen. I think it's maybe rocky that we never knew where he overwintered, and he has lived a long time. So our sightings in the wintering grounds are definitely not as thorough as in the breeding grounds, just because we obviously have monitors staffing a lot of these locations throughout the summer.
Also, Chicago area birders are just better.
Yeah, they're just superior. So yeah, I don't think it's concerning that we haven't seen them all winter. We don't know where a lot of our birds overwinter still. We've just discovered some of them overwintering in the Caribbean and Cuba even. So it's definitely a possibility that he'll be showing up.
Sarah, Dr. Cuthbert, had some speculation on where Monty would be, because obviously Rose, we know, made it down to the Keys.
Not the key.
What percentage, or I think she supposed that Monty could potentially be in the Yucatan. What is kind of the wintering range of Great Lakes plovers? I mean, are these birds regularly seen down there, or are they just kind of all over the place, and do they intermix with the Atlantic and Western, the Great Plains population?
They tend to kind of have their own wintering locations. They don't do a lot of mixing, so the Great Plains population tends to overwinter in the Gulf Coast, just because it's more like a straight shot down. And our birds don't really overwinter in the Gulf Coast. We have a few individuals that get sighted down there in the winter, but not very many. For the most part, our birds are found wintering along the Carolinas, Florida, the Atlantic coast of Florida, down into the Caribbean. I mean, it's a possibility that he could be overwintering in the Yucatan. We don't have a lot of sightings down there, so it's kind of hard to say. But for the most part, we have a lot of dedicated volunteers that are looking for them, mostly in the Carolinas and Florida.
So Sarah, Monty was actually spotted on the Texas coast, Boulevard, 2 years ago. So not this winter, but 2 winters ago, he was seen there. So that's where the speculation came from.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
That he could end up in that area overwintering.
Yeah.
Cool. Edward, any other audience questions you have queued up there for us?
The only other one I actually have is from Tamima. So if you're going to keep going, you asked earlier about male plover site fidelity. And just, yeah, if you guys have anybody else has any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll give you guys a shout out here.
Yeah, so Sarah, actually, I was intrigued by your research finding that the fledgling did better. I'm trying to remember actually now what your finding was, but that if the fledgling, I think the fledglings did better if the female had site fidelity. Is that what it was? Or if
the female's location experience, was really important to predicting how many fledglings she would produce.
Okay, and I think what I was, I forget what the slide said exactly, but Rose actually left before the chicks left. So I think you were saying they were more likely to fledge if the female, something about the female being there. But what we noticed was that Rose actually left before the chicks fledged. And so I was wondering if it was also, if you had noticed anything similar about the males.
Yeah, so it's actually very common that the female leaves before the male, even before chicks fledge, because they depart on fall migration earlier. So the female location experience really comes in with her selection of the nest site. So even though males come back first and they find a territory and defend it, the female can kind of persuade him in one way or another. And I think somebody alluded to this already, that the second choice for the nest last year was a better location. So it's really like if the female is returning to that same nesting site every year, she's accruing that experience, and that is predictive of her lifetime fledgling success. Whereas for males, that's not really the case from our research. And I think that's partly because they're kind of tied to that territory and they come back to the same one every year because they know they can defend it, whether or not they've been successful at that nest site before. So I think that's the key difference, that they can, since males are the ones coming back and defending that territory, they could just be tied to it, whether or not it's a good site. Whereas females have the chance to kind of do some prospecting and they can come back and be like, hey, no, this doesn't work for me, and then they choose a different site, and then she's successful at that site and keeps returning. So does that make sense a little bit more?
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question from John Bates. You want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I was just interested if there are data on where the juveniles end up and whether they end up together in the wintering grounds.
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't get as many sightings with juveniles, but we have, I think there is one plover story on that website about 2 sisters that ended up overwintering together. At least we have the observation of both of them sighted in the same place. And we've had some records over time where, you know, siblings will end up being seen in the same wintering location, but we don't know for sure how consistent that is, if they're always going to be wintering in the same area. Most likely not.
All right, and Matt and Vicky Igleski, you guys had a question, and I think we'll go ahead and wrap with that one.
Yeah, I put her name on it because she wanted to know. If anyone knows if, so I don't know if Sarah or Louise or whoever might know, are they gonna still try to open the rearing station even though I know none of the universities are opening or anything? Is that still gonna go?
That's a good question. That's in discussions right now. They're having trouble getting permission to staff it with the different zookeepers. So we've talked about, I'm saying this as if I'm part of the recovery, the people who make these rules, but we've talked about being a little bit more proactive with pulling eggs, and if they're close to the shoreline or if we're having a big storm coming and they might flood out. we have several incubators throughout the Great Lakes region. So we could pull eggs, incubate them overnight to ensure that they survive and then put them back out. So that might be a strategy that we just have to adopt if we can't guarantee that we'll be able to have chick rearing.
So Sarah, I don't have a question, but a request. Since you have a green and yellow Packer plover, if you get a blue and orange tagged one, I request either like Peyton plover or Ditka plover. So we need a Chicago plover bear. There you go. But so yeah, I'd like to thank all the panelists, and especially Sarah, our speaker, Edward, or I think we're going to throw over to Stephanie here. Stephanie or Edward for kind of some closing. I know Stephanie has her trivia questions.
Okay, so maybe this one is maybe more of a memory quiz, but put in the chat your answer to the first question. How many Great Lakes piping plovers nested last year? Yes, Kristen said 71. Got it first. Good job, everyone. Oh, Jessica says 142. So I think it depends on how I stated the question. Both are right. 71 pairs. All right. And our next question was, which shorebird has the longest migration that also passes through Chicago? And you may refute my answer based on what I found on Google. So the answer so far, red knot, sanderling. Any other answers?
So the question is one that passes through Chicago, like a known population, the longest migration?
A known type of bird that has the longest migration of any shorebird that passes through Chicago. I'm not seeing the answer yet, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just let you know unless I'm missing it. But I found through Google at least that it was the pectoral sandpiper, and that they have an 18,000 mile round trip, and some of the birds that winter in southern South America may actually breed in Siberia.
Hot dang. That's a lot of miles.
You didn't include the Arctic tern as a shorebird, I guess. It was up at Great Lakes a few years ago.
Fair, yeah, I didn't. Arctic tern also has an incredible migration.
Well, I think this is definitely a trivia where we all come away winners. We all learned something here today. But real quick, let's just give a real quick round of applause, virtual, silent, or however you want, for our awesome speakers. Seriously, thank you all so much for joining us here this evening. This was a really great evening. I think we all learned a heck of a lot. And I don't know about you guys, but I am super pumped for Plover Watch 2020, whatever form that takes, and especially Plover lasers. I'm really psyched about that. So, you know, however that manifests, I'm all here for it. So yes, thank you so much for our speakers. Thank you, Carl, for moderating. Thank you, everybody who's here right now. Thank you all for participating, joining us this evening. Like I said at the beginning, this is an ongoing series, so keep your eyes peeled. We don't have our speakers all nailed down just yet, but we have several programs lined up through May and June of the same nature, and we hope you guys will join us for that as well. They're going to be just as awesome as this one, I'm assuming, because, you know, we're an awesome organization that's doing this in partnership with Chicago Audubon and Peggy Notabart. But then last but not least, if you guys enjoyed this or enjoy this series, please consider coming over to our website at chicagobirder.org, becoming a member, supporting this kind of work, because this is definitely the kind of thing that we enjoy doing, and I hope you guys enjoy seeing it, and, you know, being able to access these folks as well. And it's $20. What is that? You know, dinner out, and, you know, that can really go a long way to helping your local conservation efforts for plovers and beyond. So thank you all so much for coming out here tonight, joining us, and have a great evening, everybody.
Good night.